Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a tale from Shakespeare's time, but with something far more compelling. What happens when you take his sharpest comedy about love and drop it into post-war England, 1946? Because believe it or not, translating Much Ado About Nothing into a world of RAF officers, country estates and couples trying to find love after surviving a war makes the bard's wit hit even harder. From masked dances to scheming villains, from stubborn hearts to reputations destroyed and restored. This is a story where romance battles cynicism and truth fights its way through deception. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background sound you love, and let's drift into 1940s England together. This is a story of love, pride, betrayal, and redemption, and it all begins at a manor house called Messina Hall. The summer of 1946 arrived at Messina Hall like a long-held breath finally released. The war had ended, the boys were coming home, and the ancient estate in the Cotswolds, with its honey-colored stone and climbing roses, prepared to welcome them as it had welcomed soldiers for 300 years. Lady Leonora Messina stood on the terrace in her tailored dove-gray suit, her silver hair pinned in the fashion of women who had held estates together while their men fought abroad. She held a telegram in her gloved hands, reading it for the third time that morning. Her niece, Hero, stood beside her, a vision of post-war English beauty with dark curls and gentle eyes, wearing a floral tea dress that caught the morning breeze. "They'll arrive by motorcar this afternoon," Lady Leonora said, her voice carrying that particular blend of relief and formality that the English reserve for moments of deep emotion. "Squadron leader Don Pedro and his officers. They're driving down from London. The War Office has been most generous in giving them leave." Hero smiled, her hands clasped before her. "And Captain Claudio will be among them." Lady Leonora's eyes, sharp despite her years, caught the color rising in her niece's cheeks. "Indeed, the young pilot who spent that Christmas here in 42. I trust you remember him?" "I remember he was very kind," Hero said softly, looking out over the gardens where groundskeepers were trimming hedges that had grown wild during the war years. Down the gravel path, past the rose garden where petals fell like confetti, came Beatrice Thornton. She wore trousers, still scandalous in the countryside, and a simple white blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her auburn hair was pinned back practically, and she carried a basket of cut flowers from the kitchen garden. Beatrice had spent the war years at Messina Hall, working the land as part of the Women's Land Army, and though the war had ended, she'd stayed on. There was an understanding, unspoken but known, that Beatrice belonged here as much as the ancient oaks. She climbed the terrace steps with the easy confidence of someone who had earned her place through work rather than birth. "The rooms are prepared, Lady Leonora. Fresh linens, windows opened to air them out. Mrs. Quickly has outdone herself in the kitchens. You'd think we were preparing for the king himself, rather than a handful of RAF officers." Lady Leonora smiled. "Don Pedro served with my late husband's nephew. These men are heroes, Beatrice. We shall treat them as such." "Heroes," Beatrice repeated, setting down her basket. "Yes, I suppose they are. Though I've found that heroes in uniform are often merely men once they remove their wings and ribbons." Hero looked at her cousin, for they called each other cousin though no blood tied them, only affection and shared years. "You're terribly cynical, Beatrice. I'm terribly practical, darling. There's a difference." Lady Leonora's lips twitched with amusement. "Squadron leader Don Pedro writes that he brings his brother John as well. Apparently the man has had a rather difficult war. They hope the countryside will restore his spirits." "Another soldier needing restoration," Beatrice said, arranging the flowers absently. "How many broken men must England's country houses mend?" "As many as necessary," Lady Leonora replied with gentle firmness. "We've survived 6 years of war, my dear. We can certainly survive a fortnight of house guests." The church bells in the village began to ring, not the frantic warning peals of the war years, but the steady, peaceful tolling that marked midday. Across the estate, life continued its return to normalcy. Gardeners worked. Maids polished silver that had been hidden away. And in the garage, the old Rolls-Royce was being prepared for the drive to meet the guests at the village station if needed. Hero moved to the stone balustrade, looking down the long drive lined with elms. "Do you suppose Captain Claudio will remember me? It's been 4 years. I was barely 20 then, and rather silly, I'm afraid." Beatrice came to stand beside her. "You were never silly, Hero. Sweet, perhaps. Kind, certainly, but never silly." She paused, then added with studied casualness, "Lady Leonora, the telegram mentioned other officers. Do we know their names?" "Ah, yes." Lady Leonora consulted the paper again. "Captain Claudio, of course. And—" She paused, and something in her expression suggested she was enjoying herself. "Lieutenant Benedick Hobbs." The name hung in the air like a note from a piano, resonating in the summer stillness. Beatrice's hands stilled on the flowers. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but Hero, who knew her well, saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. "Benedick Hobbs," Beatrice said flatly. "How perfectly delightful." "You know him?" Hero asked, though she already knew the answer. "We grew up together," Beatrice said, "before he went off to Oxford and then to war, before he became a man of the world and I became—" She gestured to herself, to her practical clothes and capable hands. "This." Lady Leonora watched her with kind eyes. "He was the estate manager's son, wasn't he? Clever boy. Your father's letters mentioned he'd done quite well for himself. Distinguished himself in the RAF. I'm sure he's become insufferable," Beatrice said briskly, returning to her flowers with renewed vigor. "He always had too high an opinion of himself. I can only imagine what military glory has done to his ego." The motor car arrived at 3:30, a military vehicle driven by a young corporal who looked hardly old enough to shave. Behind it came a second car, a civilian Austin that had seen better days. The vehicles crunched up the gravel drive, and Lady Leonora descended the front steps to greet her guests. Hero at her side in a fresh dress of pale blue, her dark hair carefully arranged. Beatrice had changed into a skirt, conceding to propriety. Though she'd refused Hero's offer of lipstick, she stood slightly behind and to the left, in that position that women of ambiguous social standing occupied. Not quite family, not quite servant, but something in between that the English understood instinctively. The first man to emerge from the vehicle was squadron leader Don Pedro. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate. His medals caught the afternoon sun. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had survived the war by being extremely good at his job. "Lady Leonora," he said, taking her hand with genuine warmth, "you cannot know what it means to see Messina Hall again. In the cockpit over France, I often thought of these gardens, this peace. You are most welcome, squadron leader. This house is honored to receive you." Behind Don Pedro came Captain Claudio, and Hero's breath caught audibly. He was golden-haired and handsome in the way of RAF pilots in recruitment posters, with clear blue eyes and a boyish smile that the war had not entirely erased. When he saw Hero, he stopped mid-step, and for a moment the world seemed to contain only the two of them. "Miss Hero," he said softly, that is, I hoped, you've grown even more beautiful." Hero blushed the color of the roses climbing the manor walls. "Captain Claudio, welcome home." The third man emerged slowly, reluctantly. This was John, Don Pedro's half-brother, and the war had not been kind to him. Where Don Pedro carried himself with confidence, John moved like a man expecting ambush. He was lean to the point of gauntness, with dark eyes that seemed to calculate and measure everything they touched. His uniform was correct but somehow disheveled, as though he wore it under sufferance. "My brother John," Don Pedro said, his voice carrying a note of warning or perhaps apology. "He's been unwell. We hope the country air will restore him." John offered a minimal bow, said nothing, and moved past into the house as though desperate to escape scrutiny. Then came the fourth man, and Beatrice felt her spine straighten involuntarily. Lieutenant Benedick Hobbs had changed. The boy who'd left for Oxford had been tall and awkward, all knees and elbows and clever words. The man who emerged from the Austin was tall still, but the awkwardness had been replaced by an easy athleticism. He wore his uniform casually, cap tucked under his arm, dark hair slightly too long for regulations. His face had matured, strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, but his eyes still held that infuriating sparkle of perpetual amusement, as though life were an elaborate joke only he fully understood. He saw her immediately. Those eyes locked onto hers with the precision of a bombardier finding his target. "Beatrice Thornton," he said, and his voice had deepened, but retained its mocking musicality. "Still at Messina Hall. How perfectly stationary of you." "Benedick Hobbs," she replied evenly, "still presuming your observations are wanted. How perfectly consistent." He grinned, actually grinned, as though she'd complimented him. "The war ends, empires crumble, but Beatrice's tongue remains as sharp as ever. There's comfort in such continuity, and your ego remains as inflated, another universal constant." "Children," Lady Leonora interjected with the tone of someone breaking up a familiar quarrel. "Perhaps we might continue this reunion inside. Tea is prepared, and I'm certain our guests would appreciate refreshment after their journey." Don Pedro watched Beatrice and Benedick with obvious interest. "Old friends, I take it?" "We grew up together," Benedick said, moving up the steps. As he passed Beatrice, he added quietly, "Just for her. Though I see you've grown up quite nicely. The Land Army uniform suits you better than those awful pinafores you wore as a girl. And military service has made you even more insufferable than Latin classes did. I didn't think it possible." Inside Messina Hall, the drawing room had been prepared with the kind of understated elegance that old money provided. Tea service in Georgian silver, sandwiches with the crusts cut off, scones with jam and cream rationed but present. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating oil portraits of Messina ancestors who seemed to gaze down with vague approval at this latest generation. Claudio could not take his eyes from Hero. He sat beside her on the settee, their conversation quiet and earnest, while Don Pedro engaged Lady Leonora in discussion of the estate, of post-war recovery, of the new government's plans for Britain. Benedick sprawled in a leather armchair with the casual entitlement of someone who'd once lived in the groundskeeper's cottage, but now felt himself equal to anyone. He held his teacup with mock delicacy. "So tell me, Beatrice," he said, "what occupies your days now that you're not being called upon to feed the nation? Needlepoint, watercolors, the cultivation of rose gardens and virginal sensibilities?" Beatrice set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "I occupy myself with the work of running an estate, actually. While men were busy playing hero in the skies, some of us were keeping England functioning on the ground. The fields don't plow themselves, Lieutenant. The livestock don't tend themselves. The accounts don't balance themselves." "Playing hero," Benedick repeated, his smile fading slightly. "Yes, that's precisely what it was. Great fun. Dodging German fighters over the Channel. Marvelous entertainment. Watching one's friends burn in their cockpits." The room fell quiet. Even Claudio and Hero's conversation stopped. Beatrice felt the rebuke like a slap. "I didn't mean—" "Of course you didn't," Benedick said, his light tone returning, though something harder remained beneath it. "You never do mean the sharpest cuts, Beatrice. They simply emerge, naturally as breathing." Lady Leonora, sensing the need for intervention, rose gracefully. "Hero dear, why don't you show Captain Claudio the gardens? The roses are particularly fine this year, despite the neglect they suffered during the war." Hero stood immediately, grateful for escape. "Yes, of course. Captain, would you care to see them?" Claudio leapt to his feet with such eagerness that Benedick snorted quietly into his tea. "I would be honored, Miss Hero." They departed through the French doors, Hero's pale blue dress catching the breeze, Claudio's hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching, the careful dance of proper courtship. Don Pedro watched them go with satisfaction. "A fine young woman, Lady Leonora. Your niece has become quite remarkable." "She has survived the war with her sweetness intact," Lady Leonora said. "That itself is remarkable in these times." Outside on the terrace, Visible through the windows, Hero and Claudio walked the stone paths between beds of lavender and late-blooming roses. They moved slowly, finding their way back to whatever connection had sparked 4 years earlier during that wartime Christmas when Claudio had been stationed nearby. "He's besotted," Benedick observed from his chair. "Completely gone. I've seen that look before, usually right before a man does something catastrophically stupid." "You're a cynic, Lieutenant," Lady Leonora said with amusement. "I'm a realist, Lady Leonora. Romance is a temporary madness, like shell shock, but with more poetry and worse judgment." Beatrice couldn't help herself. "And what would you know of romance, Benedick? Have you loved anyone besides yourself? I love many things. Freedom, reason, good whiskey, the ability to wake each morning without the burden of another person's expectations. How very lonely that sounds. And how very suffocating your alternative sounds. Marriage is simply a slow-motion surrender of everything that makes life bearable." Don Pedro laughed. "You'll sing a different tune one day, Benedick. Some woman will catch you and you'll fall harder than any of us." "Never," Benedick declared. "I shall remain a bachelor until the end of my days. Let other men shackle themselves willingly. I fought for freedom. I shan't surrender it to some woman with pretty eyes and expectations of domestic servitude." "Domestic servitude?" Beatrice repeated. "You mean partnership, companionship, love?" "I mean the gradual erasure of self in favor of coupledom. No, thank you." "On that, at least, we agree," Beatrice said firmly. "I've no intention of becoming some man's housewife, surrendering my independence for the dubious privilege of darning his socks and bearing his children." "Well then," Benedick said, raising his teacup in mock toast, "to eternal bachelorhood and spinsterhood, may we die alone but free." "To freedom," Beatrice echoed, though something in her voice suggested the toast wasn't entirely sincere. Don Pedro exchanged glances with Lady Leonora, and in that look passed the kind of understanding that older, wiser people share when watching the young protest too much. In the gardens, Claudio and Hero had stopped beside the fountain, a bronze Neptune weathered by 3 centuries of English rain. Claudio took Hero's hand gently, carefully, as though she were made of spun glass. "I thought of you constantly," he said quietly. "During the missions, during the long nights in the barracks, the memory of your face, of your kindness that Christmas, it sustained me." Hero looked up at him, her dark eyes luminous. "And I prayed for you, Captain, every night. I read the casualty lists with my heart in my throat, terrified I'd see your name." "I survived," he said simply. "And now I'm here, and you're here, and I find myself hoping, that is, if it's not too presumptuous. Might I court you properly, Hero? Might I hope that your affections could in time match my own?" Hero's smile was radiant. "You may hope, Captain, indeed you may do more than hope." Inside, Don Pedro moved to stand beside Benedick and spoke quietly. "Claudio means to marry her. He's told me as much. He wants her desperately but fears his position isn't secure enough, that he has insufficient prospects." "He's a decorated war hero," Benedick said. "Surely that counts for something." "In wartime, yes. In peacetime," Don Pedro shrugged. "He worries. He's young. He lacks confidence in matters of the heart, though he had courage enough in combat. What do you propose?" "Tonight Lady Leonora hosts a dinner dance. Small, just the household and a few neighbors. I thought I might speak to Hero on Claudio's behalf, test the waters, perhaps even advocate for him. Speed this courtship along before his nerves fail him entirely." Benedick grinned. "Playing matchmaker, squadron leader? How domestic of you. Someone must preserve romance in this cynical age, since you've clearly abdicated all responsibility for it." Evening descended upon Messina Hall with the gentle amber glow peculiar to English summers. The long drawing room had been cleared for dancing, the Persian rugs rolled back to expose polished parquet floors that reflected the light of dozens of candles. A gramophone stood in the corner, its brass horn gleaming, stacked with records. Glenn Miller, Vera Lynn, Artie Shaw, the soundtrack of a war just ended and a peace just beginning. Lady Leonora had invited neighbors from the surrounding estates, families who had endured the war years with the stoic determination that the English countryside specialized in producing. They arrived in evening wear carefully preserved from before the war, the women in gowns that had been altered and re-altered to accommodate changing fashions and rationing, the men in dinner jackets that spoke of better days and the stubborn refusal to surrender standards despite circumstances. Hero descended the staircase in a gown of pale pink silk that her mother had worn in the 20s, refashioned for her slender frame. Her dark hair was swept up, held with pearl combs, and around her throat lay a simple strand of pearls that caught the candlelight. She looked like something from another era, innocent, lovely, untouched by the hardness the war had etched into so many faces. Claudio, waiting at the bottom of the stairs in his dress uniform, stopped breathing. Beatrice came down behind her in a gown of deep emerald that brought out the auburn in her hair. Unlike Hero's softness, Beatrice wore sophistication like armor. Fitted bodice, elegant lines, a dress that suggested capability even in silk. She'd conceded to lipstick, a deep red that made her look dangerous and entirely sure of herself. Benedick, standing with Don Pedro near the drinks table, felt his carefully cultivated indifference falter. "Good God," he muttered. "When did Beatrice Thornton become beautiful?" Don Pedro smiled knowingly. "Perhaps she always was, and you were too busy arguing to notice." The evening began with the careful formality that such occasions demanded. Introductions were made, pleasantries exchanged. Lady Leonora moved through her guests with the grace of long practice, ensuring everyone felt welcomed, honored, essential to the gathering's success. The gramophone began playing, and couples moved onto the floor. Claudio claimed Hero's hand immediately, and they waltzed with the careful precision of two people acutely aware of each other's proximity. His hand at her waist was proper, respectful, but his eyes betrayed everything his posture didn't. Don Pedro danced with Lady Leonora, discussing in low tones the matter of Claudio and Hero, the squadron leader making his case for his young captain with diplomatic skill. "He's honorable," Don Pedro said as they turned in time to the music. "He has his pension from the RAF and prospects with his family's shipping business in Southampton. More than that, he's decent, kind, and utterly devoted to your niece." Lady Leonora glanced toward where Hero and Claudio danced, observing the way they looked at each other with the intensity of people discovering something rare and precious. "Hero's happiness is paramount. If she wishes this match, she has my blessing. Though perhaps we shouldn't rush them. Let them find their way naturally. Time is a luxury young love rarely feels it possesses," Don Pedro said with a smile. Across the room, John sat alone in a chair by the windows, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the dancing with dark hooded eyes. He looked like a man attending his own funeral, bitter and removed. The war had broken something in him, something fundamental, and no amount of country peace seemed capable of mending it. A young lieutenant from a neighboring estate, emboldened by champagne, approached John with the cheerful obliviousness of someone who hadn't learned to recognize damage in others. "Dreadful, isn't it?" the young man said with a laugh. "All this dancing and gaiety makes one feel rather cynical about the whole romance business." John looked at him with eyes like winter. "What would you know of cynicism, boy? You look barely old enough to have seen combat." The lieutenant flushed. "I served." "You survived," John corrected coldly. "There's a difference. Now leave me to my whiskey and my thoughts. Both are bitter, and I prefer them undiluted by your chatter." The young man retreated hastily, and John returned to his surveillance of the room, his gaze eventually settling on his half-brother. Don Pedro, always perfect, always honorable, always winning the admiration and respect that should have been shared between them. The bitterness in John's chest coiled tighter. Benedick found himself standing beside Beatrice at the edge of the dance floor, both of them watching the dancers with expressions of studied disinterest. "Not dancing, Beatrice?" he asked. "Afraid someone might step on your toes, or merely afraid that enjoyment might crack that fortress of independence you've constructed?" "Not dancing, Benedick," she countered. "Afraid a woman might interpret 3 minutes of proximity as a marriage proposal, or merely afraid you might actually enjoy human connection?" "I enjoy human connection tremendously. I simply prefer it temporary and uncomplicated." "How very modern of you." "Commitment phobic before the psychiatrists even had a term for it." He laughed despite himself. You know, most women find my company charming. Then by all means, go charm them. I'm certain there are several desperate widows present who'd welcome the attention. Desperate, he repeated, moving slightly closer. Is that what you think? That only desperate women would want my company? She met his eyes directly, refusing to step back, though he stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that definitely hadn't come from the groundskeeper's cottage. I think you cultivate an image of rakish charm to avoid revealing that beneath it all you're terrified of actual intimacy. The words hung between them like a challenge. Benedick's expression shifted, the casual amusement draining away to reveal something harder, more honest. And you, he said quietly, hide behind practicality and competence to avoid admitting you're lonely. We all have our armor, Beatrice. Before she could respond, Lady Leonora's voice rang out across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now have a masked dance, as was tradition in this house before the war. Masks are provided by the door. Indulge an old woman's nostalgia for more romantic times. There was laughter, a rush toward the entrance hall, where indeed a collection of Venetian masks, relics from parties decades past, had been arranged on a table. Elaborate things of silk and feathers, golden filigree and ribbons, the remnants of a world that had seemed to end in 1939. The guests donned their masks with the enthusiasm of people grateful for any excuse to play, to pretend, to be someone else for even a few moments. The war had made everyone too serious, too burdened by reality. This was permission to escape. Hero chose a delicate mask of white silk adorned with seed pearls. Claudio selected a simple black domino that made him look dashing and mysterious. Beatrice found herself behind a mask of deep burgundy that left only her eyes and mouth visible, while Benedick wore a silver half mask that somehow made his grin even more insufferable. The music changed to something slower, more intimate. Couples paired off, identities theoretically concealed, though of course everyone knew everyone else by voice, by bearing, by the way they moved. Don Pedro, masked in black and gold, approached Hero where she stood near the terrace doors. "May I have this dance, miss?" he asked, voice slightly muffled. Hero, thinking this was part of the game, accepted with a graceful curtsy. They moved onto the floor, and as they danced, Don Pedro spoke in low tones. "I wonder if I might speak frankly with you, Miss Hero. You must know that Captain Claudio holds you in the highest regard." Hero's step faltered slightly. Yes, he's been most kind. More than kind. He loves you, deeply and truly. But he's a young man unsure of his prospects, afraid of presuming too much. If you were to give him any encouragement, any sign that his affections are returned, I believe he would speak to Lady Leonora immediately about a formal courtship." Hero's cheeks colored behind her mask. "Squadron leader, for I know it's you. Captain Claudio needn't doubt his welcome. I would be honored by his suit." Don Pedro smiled with satisfaction. "Then I shall tell him so. Before this night ends, I believe you shall have a proposal, Miss Hero." They finished their dance, and Don Pedro returned Hero to the edge of the floor, just as Claudio approached, eager to claim his own dance with her. As he led her away, she whispered something that made him stop mid-step, his entire being seeming to illuminate from within. Meanwhile, Benedick had been waylaid by an elderly dowager who insisted on dancing, despite being half his height and twice his age. He endured 3 minutes of being steered about like a motor car by a particularly aggressive driver before making his escape. He retreated to the terrace for air and found John standing in the shadows, smoking a cigarette, the red ember glowing like a malevolent eye. "Not enjoying the festivities, John?" Benedick asked, leaning against the balustrade. John exhaled smoke slowly, enjoying watching fools make greater fools of themselves. Young Claudio, for instance, dancing on air because Don Pedro has apparently secured him the hand of that insipid girl. "Hero? She's not insipid. She's sweet." "Sweet," John repeated with contempt. "Yes, that's what men want, isn't it? Sweet, compliant creatures who simper and blush. Until after the wedding, of course, when they reveal their true natures. Benedick studied him. The war was hard on you. The war was honest. This, John gestured toward the lighted windows, the music, the laughter. This is the lie we tell ourselves. Happy endings, true love, honor and virtue triumphant. It's theater, Benedick. Badly written theater at that. Perhaps, or perhaps some happiness is real even if we can't share it. John's laugh was bitter. How philosophical, how noble. Tell me, does that pretty Thornton woman know you're still half in love with her, or are we maintaining the fiction of mutual disdain? Benedick stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course not. Just as Claudio doesn't know that his precious hero is probably no more virtuous than any other young woman left largely unsupervised during wartime. These country estates, all the young men gone, the Italian prisoners of war working the fields. Do you really think nothing happened? That's a vile insinuation. Is it? John crushed out his cigarette. Or is it merely realistic? But by all means, let young Claudio have his romantic delusions. They'll curdle soon enough. They always do. He walked back inside, leaving Benedick unsettled on the terrace. There was poison in John. Real poison. And Benedick wondered if Don Pedro understood just how damaged his half-brother had become. Inside, the dancing continued. Beatrice found herself claimed by a tall figure in a silver mask. Benedick, though she pretended not to know. "Do I know you, sir?" she asked with mock formality as he took her hand. "I'm a stranger passing through," he replied, playing along. "A wandering soldier seeking temporary refuge in dance." How poetic. Most soldiers I've known are far more direct in their requests. They moved together surprisingly well, finding a rhythm that felt both natural and charged with unspoken tension. "Tell me, stranger," Beatrice said as they turned in time to the music, "what do you think of love? Does a wandering soldier believe in such things?" "Love?" Benedick considered, his hand firm at her waist. "I think it's a story people tell themselves to justify their loneliness. Two people meet, mistake chemistry for destiny, and bind themselves together before realizing they'd be happier apart. How very cynical. How very honest. And you, mysterious lady, do you believe in romance?" "I believe in partnership," Beatrice said carefully. "Two people of matched intellect and respect, building something together. But the hearts and flowers nonsense, the poetry and sighing, that's just decoration masking contractual obligation. Then we're in agreement. How refreshing." "How depressing," she corrected. "That two people can dance together and agree that dancing means nothing." The music swelled, and he pulled her slightly closer. Not improperly, but enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solidity. Perhaps this particular dance means something after all. She looked up at him, at the eyes behind the silver mask that she'd known since childhood. "You know perfectly well who I am, Benedick. And you've known me from the first step, Beatrice. But perhaps behind masks we can say true things we'd never dare otherwise. Then let me say this truly. You're an insufferable, arrogant man who uses wit as a weapon to keep everyone at arm's length. And I pity whatever woman is foolish enough to think she can reach the human being underneath all that performance." His grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you're a woman so determined to prove she needs no one that you've convinced yourself loneliness is virtue. We're quite a pair of disasters, aren't we?" The music ended. They stood for a moment, still close, still connected by their clasped hands, the air between them charged with something that felt dangerously like honesty. Then Beatrice pulled away, executed a perfect curtsy, and walked toward the terrace without looking back. Benedick watched her go, aware that something had shifted, some barrier had thinned, and he wasn't entirely certain he was pleased about it. By the fountain in the garden, visible through the French doors, Claudio knelt before Hero in the moonlight. The masks were gone now, abandoned. He held both her hands in his, and his voice carried through the open doors with the earnest intensity of absolute sincerity. "Hero Messina, I know I should wait, should court you properly for months before speaking, but the war taught me that time is precious and tomorrow is never guaranteed. I love you. I've loved you since that Christmas 4 years ago when you played carols on the piano and smiled at me like I was someone worthy of your attention. Will you marry me? Will you make me the happiest man in England?" Inside the drawing room, all conversation had stopped. Everyone watched, suspended in that collective breath that accompanies life's pivotal moments. Hero's eyes shone with tears that caught the moonlight. "Yes, Claudio. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He stood, swept her into his arms, and kissed her with such pure joy that even the cynics in the room, and there were several, felt something catch in their throats. Applause broke out. Don Pedro clapped Benedick on the shoulder with satisfaction. Lady Leonora dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even some of the sterner gentlemen present looked misty. Only John, standing in the corner with fresh whiskey, watched with an expression of cold contempt. And Beatrice, returned from the terrace, felt an unexpected pang of something she refused to name. She was happy for Hero, truly happy. But watching her cousin embrace such open, vulnerable joy made her own careful defenses feel suddenly heavy. Benedick appeared at her elbow, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He offered her one without comment. "To Hero and Claudio," he said quietly. "May they be the exception that proves our cynical rules." "2 exceptions," Beatrice agreed, touching her glass to his. They drank in companionable silence while around them the party erupted into celebration. Lady Leonora announced the engagement officially, promising a wedding within the month. "No point waiting," she declared, "when happiness is at hand." Don Pedro drew Benedick aside later in the evening, his expression gleaming with mischief. "I have a new project, Lieutenant. God help me. The last time you had that look, we ended up bombing a munitions factory with half the fuel we needed. This is far less dangerous and far more entertaining. I've been watching you and Miss Beatrice dance around each other like 2 cats in a sack. It's exhausting and ridiculous. We're friends who enjoy verbal sparring, nothing more. You're 2 stubborn fools in love who are too proud to admit it. And I intend to remedy that situation." Benedick laughed. "You can't be serious. Beatrice and I would murder each other within a week of marriage, or discover you're perfectly matched. I propose a campaign, subtle, careful, to make each of you believe the other is secretly in love with you. Once convinced, pride will do the rest." "That's insane. So was flying bombers over Berlin, yet we managed. Are you afraid, Benedick?" "Of Beatrice Thornton. Terrified. That woman could flay a man with her tongue." "Then you'll help me?" Morning broke over Messina Hall with the crystalline clarity that follows rain. The gardens sparkled with dew, each blade of grass jeweled, each rose petal heavy with moisture. The house stirred slowly. The guests had stayed late celebrating Hero and Claudio's engagement, and now paid the price in late rising and thick heads. Benedick woke early despite the champagne, years of military discipline making sleep past dawn impossible. He dressed in casual clothes, grey flannel trousers, white shirt, sleeves rolled, and went walking in the gardens, seeking the peace that only English countryside mornings could provide. He settled eventually in the orchard beyond the formal gardens, where apple trees heavy with fruit formed a natural arbor. There was a bench here, old stone worn smooth by generations, and Benedick sat reading a book of poetry he'd found in the library. Dawn appropriately cynical about love, enjoying the solitude. He didn't notice Don Pedro, Lady Leonora, and Claudio enter the orchard from the far end, speaking in voices just loud enough to carry. "I tell you it's true," Don Pedro was saying. "I've observed it myself these past days. Beatrice Thornton is desperately in love with Benedick." Benedick's head snapped up. He remained perfectly still behind the apple tree, invisible to the speakers but able to hear every word. "Poor girl," Lady Leonora said with genuine sympathy. "She hides it well, but I've known her since childhood. I've never seen her so unsettled as when Lieutenant Hobbs is present." "Does he know?" Claudio asked. "Good heavens, no," Lady Leonora replied. "And we mustn't tell him. Beatrice would be mortified. You know her pride. She'd rather die than have Benedick discover her feelings and mock them." "He would mock them," Don Pedro agreed gravely. "The man's a committed bachelor, forever declaring his independence. If he knew that Beatrice lay awake at night thinking of him, wrote his name in the margins of books, blushed whenever someone mentioned his RAF victories. He'd torture her with it. Behind the tree, Benedick's poetry book hung forgotten in his hands. Beatrice, in love with him. I found her crying in the rose garden yesterday, Lady Leonora continued, the lie flowing smooth as honey. She thought herself alone. When I asked what troubled her, she claimed hay fever, but I know heartbreak when I see it. Perhaps we should tell him, Claudio suggested. Benedick's a good man beneath the cynicism. Perhaps if he knew. It would destroy her, Don Pedro said firmly. No, we must keep this secret. Let Beatrice preserve her dignity. In time she'll recover and find someone worthy of her affection. Someone capable of commitment, of partnership, of meeting her formidable intellect with matched devotion. You're right, of course, Lady Leonora said sadly, though it seems cruel that two people so perfectly suited should be kept apart by one man's stubborn refusal to examine his own heart. They moved away, their voices fading, discussing wedding preparations for Hero and Claudio. Benedick sat frozen on his bench, mind racing. Beatrice in love with him, crying in gardens, writing his name in books. It seemed impossible. And yet, he thought of last night's dance, the intensity in her eyes, the way she'd said, how depressing, when they'd agreed dancing meant nothing. Could it be true? And more importantly, the thought crept in unbidden. How did he feel about it? He stood pacing the orchard, poetry abandoned. Beatrice Thornton, sharp-tongued, brilliant, maddening Beatrice. He'd known her forever, fought with her constantly, thought about her, rather more than he'd admitted. If she loved him, if she'd been suffering in silence, didn't honor demand he respond? Didn't decency require he at least examine his own feelings honestly? I must be reasonable about this, he muttered to himself, still pacing. She's beautiful. That's empirically true. And intelligent, which I've always valued more than mere prettiness. And capable. Good God, the woman ran an entire estate during wartime. That's not nothing. He paused beneath an apple tree, looking back toward the house, where somewhere inside Beatrice was presumably suffering from unrequited love. Perhaps I've been a fool, he said to the empty orchard. Perhaps the thing I have been running from is exactly what I need. A partner, an equal, someone who wouldn't bore me within a fortnight. Inside the house, in the morning room overlooking the same gardens, Beatrice sat with Hero and Lady Leonora, discussing wedding details, flowers, guest lists, the trousseau that would need to be assembled from pre-war wardrobes and careful rationing coupons. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Don Pedro entered with apologies. Ladies, forgive the intrusion. Lady Leonora, might I borrow you? There's a matter regarding the wine cellar that requires your expertise. Of course, squadron leader. She rose, then paused. Hero dear, why don't you show Beatrice the wedding dress possibilities in the trunk room? The blue sitting room is quite comfortable, and you can spread out the fabrics properly. It was smoothly done. Within minutes, Beatrice and Hero were alone in a comfortable room with windows overlooking the terrace, surrounded by pre-war silks and satins that shimmered in the morning light. Below, on the terrace, just outside the open windows, Don Pedro and Claudio took their coffee, speaking in voices meant to carry upward. I'm genuinely worried about Benedick, Don Pedro said, his voice drifting up through the open windows with perfect clarity. I've known the man for years, served with him through the worst of the war, but I've never seen him like this. Beatrice's hands stilled on the ivory silk she'd been examining. Hero caught her eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. Keep quiet. Keep listening. Is it shell shock? Claudio asked with concern. I've heard it can manifest in strange ways. Depression, changes in temperament. No, it's not combat fatigue, Don Pedro said. It's worse. It's love. Below on the terrace, both men arranged themselves comfortably in wrought iron chairs, coffee cups in hand, performing for an invisible audience. Love, Claudio repeated. But Benedick's always claimed immunity to such things. He's sworn off women 100 times. Yes, well, love makes liars of us all eventually. The man is utterly besotted with Beatrice Thornton, has been for years apparently, and it's eating him alive. In the sitting room above, Beatrice had gone perfectly still, the silk forgotten in her lap. "He told you this?" Claudio asked. "Not in so many words. You know Benedick. He'd rather face a firing squad than admit vulnerability. But I've seen the signs. The way he watches her when he thinks no one's looking. The way he maneuvers to be near her, then picks fights to justify the proximity. Last night after the dance, I found him on the terrace, staring at her through the windows like a schoolboy with his first crush. Why doesn't he simply tell her?" Don Pedro laughed bitterly. "Because he's terrified she'll laugh in his face. Think about it. Beatrice Thornton, brilliant and independent, who's made it abundantly clear she's no interest in marriage, especially not to some former groundskeeper's son who got lucky in the RAF. Benedick knows his place, knows the social gap between them, and it paralyzes him." "That's absurd," Claudio protested. "The war changed everything. Class distinctions matter far less than they did, and Benedick distinguished himself tremendously. He's decorated, respected. Try telling him that. The boy who grew up in the cottage watching Beatrice grow up in the manor house, that boy is still inside him, convinced he's not good enough for her." Hero moved quietly to the window seat, positioning herself where she could watch Beatrice's face. Her cousin looked stunned, face pale, eyes wide, with something between shock and wonder. "It's tragic, really," Don Pedro continued below. "A man survives the war only to be destroyed by his own heart. I've watched him grow thinner, more bitter. All that cynicism about love, it's armor, Claudio, protection against the one woman who could actually hurt him. Someone should tell her. Perhaps if Beatrice knew—" "Absolutely not," Don Pedro said sharply. "Benedick would never forgive the interference. And honestly, would Beatrice welcome such knowledge? She's made her position clear on marriage, on independence. Learning that Benedick loves her would only burden her with unwanted responsibility for his feelings." "Poor devil," Claudio said sympathetically. "To love so hopelessly. The worst part is they'd be perfect together. I've never seen two people so intellectually matched, so capable of challenging each other. But pride and fear keep them circling like wary dogs, snarling when they'd rather embrace." There was a pause, the sound of coffee being sipped, morning birds singing in the garden below. "He'll recover eventually," Don Pedro said, though his tone suggested doubt. "Time heals most wounds, though I suspect Benedick will carry this particular scar for the rest of his life. There are some women a man never truly gets over." They rose, their voices fading as they moved back into the house, conversation shifting to mundane matters of the day's plans. In the sitting room, silence stretched, taut and trembling. Hero spoke first, softly. "Beatrice, are you all right?" Beatrice looked up, her face a study in confusion. "Benedick loves me?" "Apparently, though I'm surprised as you are. He's always seemed so determinedly opposed to attachment. He watches me." Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "He thinks about me." "So it would seem." Hero moved to sit beside her cousin, taking her hand gently. "How do you feel about it?" Beatrice stood abruptly, moving to the window, looking down at the terrace where the men had been sitting. "I don't know. I thought we've always fought, always contradicted each other. I assumed he found me tiresome, difficult. Perhaps the fighting was his way of maintaining connection, the only way he knew how. He thinks he's not good enough for me because of birth, because of class." Beatrice's voice held something fierce. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The war should have taught us that breeding means nothing compared to character, to courage." "Then you do care for him?" Beatrice turned, and her expression was no longer confused but determined. "I've always cared for him, if I'm honest, but I convinced myself it was impossible, that we were too different, too combative. If there's a chance, if he truly feels as Don Pedro says, then perhaps I've been the fool, protecting myself from something that might actually make me happy." "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," Beatrice said slowly, "but I think it's time I stopped hiding behind independence and started being honest. If Benedick can be brave enough to love me secretly, I can be brave enough to meet him halfway." The change in Benedick and Beatrice over the following days was remarkable to those who knew what to look for, and Don Pedro watched his handiwork with undisguised satisfaction. Benedick, who had always been carelessly dressed, suddenly appeared at breakfast in perfectly pressed trousers and shirts that looked suspiciously new. He'd visited the village barber, tamed his hair, and even acquired a bottle of proper cologne. More striking was the change in his manner. He was gentler with Beatrice, his teasing stripped of its usual edge, replaced by something that almost resembled tenderness. When Beatrice entered rooms, Benedick stood immediately. When she spoke, he listened with full attention rather than planning his next clever retort. When she made jokes, he laughed with genuine delight rather than competitive one-upmanship. Beatrice, for her part, had softened visibly. The sharp edges of her wit remained, but she wielded them with affection now rather than defense. She smiled more, especially when Benedick was near. She'd begun wearing her hair down occasionally, softer styles that framed her face. She touched him, casual brushes of hands, a touch on his shoulder when passing, small physical connections that spoke of growing intimacy. At dinner one evening, with the household gathered around Lady Leonora's table, the conversation turned to wedding preparations. "The ceremony will be in the chapel on the grounds," Hero said, her hand linked with Claudio's on the tablecloth. "Small, intimate, just family and close friends. The war taught us that elaborate ceremonies matter less than sincere promises." "Wisely said," Don Pedro agreed, raising his wineglass. "Though we shall still celebrate properly afterward. England has had precious little joy these past years. We're owed a proper party." "Music and dancing?" Beatrice asked. "I think we can manage that, even with rationing." "You enjoyed the dancing the other night," Benedick observed, his tone casual but his eyes intent on her face. "I noticed you were quite graceful. Poetry in motion, one might say." Beatrice met his gaze, something warm passing between them. "The right partner makes all the difference. When one dances with someone truly compatible, the steps come naturally." "Compatibility is underrated," Benedick agreed. "I used to think independence was the highest virtue, but perhaps I was simply afraid of finding someone who could match me step for step." Across the table, Don Pedro and Claudio exchanged triumphant looks. Only John, sitting at the far end, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He saw what was happening. His brother's meddling had succeeded in bringing together two people who were irritatingly pleased with themselves. More galling, Claudio sat there glowing with engagement bliss while Hero gazed at him with nauseating adoration. Everyone was happy. Everyone was pairing off. Everyone had found purpose and connection in the peace that John found only hollow and bitter. After dinner, John retired to the library where he found Conrad, a young corporal who'd served under Don Pedro and had accompanied them to Messina Hall. Conrad was weak-willed and easily influenced, precisely the sort of man John needed. "They're all fools," John said, pouring whiskey for both of them. "Prancing about like children playing house. Romance and wedding bells while the world burns." "The war's over, sir," Conrad ventured carefully. "Is it? Or have we simply paused before the next catastrophe? And meanwhile these idiots bind themselves together with promises they'll inevitably break." John drank deeply. Young Claudio especially, so proud of his virtuous bride, his innocent flower. "Miss Hero does seem quite pure," Conrad said. "Does she?" John's smile was unpleasant. "What do we really know of her war years? She was here, essentially unsupervised while we were fighting, young and beautiful, with only an elderly aunt as guardian. Do you truly believe nothing happened?" "I've no reason to think." "That's because you don't think, period. But I do. And I think Claudio is rushing into marriage with a woman whose virtue may be more performance than reality." Conrad looked uncomfortable. "Even if that were true, what business is it of ours?" John leaned forward, eyes glittering with malice. "My brother orchestrated this match. He takes credit for Claudio's happiness. How satisfying it would be if that happiness proved false, if the perfect wedding became a perfect scandal." Don Pedro's judgment questioned, Claudio's heart broken, the whole self-satisfied household brought low. "You're talking about destroying an innocent girl's reputation." "I'm talking about revealing truth," John corrected smoothly. "If Hero is innocent, no harm done. But if she has secrets, and everyone has secrets, Conrad, then Claudio deserves to know before he binds himself legally to damaged goods. How would we even... Leave that to me. I simply need you to play a small part when the time comes. Nothing too difficult. Just corroborate a story. Confirm what Claudio's own eyes will show him. John poured more whiskey. You're loyal to Don Pedro, aren't you? Wouldn't you want him protected from the embarrassment of promoting a false match? Conrad hesitated, swimming in moral territory far beyond his depth. I suppose if it's a matter of truth. Precisely, truth. The foundation of honor, yes? John raised his glass. To truth, Conrad, however painful it may prove. They drank, and in that moment the seeds of destruction were planted. Outside in the garden, unaware of the plot forming in the library, Benedick and Beatrice walked together under stars that seemed impossibly bright after years of wartime blackouts. Tell me honestly, Benedick said, stopping beneath an ancient oak. Have I been a complete fool about you? Beatrice looked up at him, moonlight catching in her eyes. We've both been fools, I think. Too proud, too defended, too afraid of being hurt to risk being happy. And now? Now I think perhaps bravery isn't only for battlefields. Perhaps the greatest courage is admitting you need someone else. He reached for her hand tentatively, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their fingers intertwined, and in that simple gesture was promise and possibility, and the beginning of something neither had quite believed could exist. The night before the wedding arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that precedes storms. The air felt thick, charged, as though the atmosphere itself sensed impending catastrophe. Hero's room in the east wing glowed with lamplight, filled with the gentle chaos of final preparations. Her wedding dress, pre-war ivory silk that had been her mother's, altered lovingly by the village seamstress, hung on the wardrobe like a ghost of happiness. Beatrice sat on the bed helping Hero press flowers for her bouquet, their conversation soft and intimate. Are you nervous? Beatrice asked, carefully arranging white roses between sheets of tissue paper. Terrified, Hero admitted with a small laugh. But in the best way. Claudio is everything I could want. Kind, honorable, devoted. I'm the luckiest woman in England. He's the lucky one, Beatrice corrected firmly. You're giving him a gift beyond measure. Your trust, your future, yourself. Hero looked at her cousin with affection. You and Benedick seem to be finding your way towards something similar. I've noticed the change between you. Beatrice colored slightly. Perhaps. We're talking about possibilities, about what might be if we're both brave enough. It's strange. I spent so long being certain I'd never marry, and now I find myself imagining it might not be the prison I'd thought. With the right person, it's freedom, Hero said softly. The freedom to be fully yourself with someone who sees all of you and loves you anyway. A knock interrupted them, and Margaret, one of the housemaids, entered with tea. She was a pretty girl, perhaps 22, with blonde hair and a figure that had caught the attention of several young men from the village. Your tea, Miss Hero, and Lady Leonora asks if you need anything else before retiring. No, thank you, Margaret. We're nearly finished here. The maid lingered, arranging cups unnecessarily. It's ever so romantic, miss. The whole house is talking about it. A real wartime love story with a happy ending. Let's hope so, Hero said with a smile. After Margaret left, Beatrice frowned slightly. That girl seems restless lately. Nervous. The wedding has everyone unsettled. It's a big event for the household. Perhaps. But Beatrice filed the observation away, some instinct prickling. In the library below, John was executing his plan with the careful precision of a military operation. He'd drawn Claudio and Don Pedro into conversation, ostensibly about wedding day logistics, but gradually steering toward darker waters. Tomorrow you'll be a married man, John said, pouring brandy with apparent goodwill, taking on all the responsibilities and risks thereof. Risks? Claudio laughed. With Hero, she's the safest choice a man could make. Of course, John said smoothly. Though I suppose one never truly knows another person, does one? We all have private selves, secret lives. Don Pedro shot his brother a warning look. What are you suggesting, John? Nothing. Simply philosophical musings. Though... He paused as if debating whether to continue. Look, I probably shouldn't say anything. It's likely nothing. Claudio's smile faded. Say what? I've seen things. Late at night. Someone at Hero's window. A man's silhouette. And I've heard Margaret the maid whispering to others about late-night visitors, though she won't say more. John shrugged. Probably innocent. A trick of the light servant gossip. I mention it only because tomorrow you'll pledge your life to this woman. You deserve certainty. The words hung in the air like poison gas, invisible but deadly. That's absurd, Don Pedro said sharply. Hero is virtue itself. John, this is beneath even you, spreading vicious rumors on the eve of a wedding. You're right, of course, forget I mentioned it. John stood as if to leave, then turned back. Though if you wanted to verify, purely to put Claudio's mind at ease, you could watch tonight. Hero's window faces the east garden. If I'm wrong, you'll see nothing but an innocent girl sleeping peacefully, and I'll apologize for my paranoia in the morning. Claudio had gone pale. You're saying I should spy on my own fiancé the night before our wedding? I'm saying that if you have doubts, better to resolve them now than to spend your wedding night wondering. But Don Pedro's right. I'm probably just war-damaged and seeing threats where none exist. He left them there. Doubt planted like a bomb with a delayed fuse. Don Pedro gripped Claudio's shoulder. Don't listen to him. John's bitter, twisted by whatever he endured in combat. Hero loves you. This is madness. But what if he's right? Claudio's voice was barely a whisper. What if I'm being made a fool? You're not. You've been orchestrating this whole courtship. What if your judgment is clouded? What if you want this match so badly that you've ignored signs, dismissed warnings? Don Pedro looked stricken. Claudio, I would never. Let's watch tonight, Claudio said suddenly, decisively. Just for an hour. We'll see nothing. I'll feel foolish. And tomorrow I'll marry Hero with complete confidence. But I need to know. I need to be certain. Midnight found Claudio and Don Pedro concealed in the east garden, hidden among the rhododendrons that bordered the manor house. Above them, Hero's window glowed dimly, a single lamp left burning, curtains partly drawn. The night was thick with mist rolling in from the fields, obscuring shapes, making shadows uncertain and sinister. This is madness, Don Pedro whispered. We're behaving like jealous schoolboys, not officers and gentlemen. 1 hour, Claudio insisted, his jaw tight. Then we'll know. They waited in silence broken only by night birds and the distant sound of the village church bell tolling the quarters. 15 minutes passed. 30. Claudio began to relax, feeling foolish, preparing to apologize to Don Pedro for entertaining John's poison. Then a shadow moved at Hero's window. Both men froze, watching as the curtains were pulled fully open. A figure appeared, unmistakably female in shape, hair tumbling loose over shoulders, wearing a pale nightgown that caught what moonlight penetrated the mist. But the mist and distance made features indistinct. It could be Hero. It appeared to be Hero. The figure at the window looked out, then turned as if speaking to someone inside the room. She laughed. The sound carried faintly down to the garden and reached out her arms in unmistakable welcome. A male figure joined her at the window, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in rough working clothes. He pulled the woman close, kissed her with obvious passion, his hands moving familiarly across her body. Claudio made a strangled sound as if he'd been struck. Don Pedro gripped his arm, equally shocked. The couple at the window embraced again, then moved away, deeper into the room. The lamp was extinguished, leaving only darkness and imagination to complete the scene. In the garden, Claudio stood frozen, his face a mask of devastation. Claudio, Don Pedro said urgently, we need to think clearly. The mist, the distance, we couldn't see faces. That might not have been. It was her window, her room. Who else would it be? Claudio's voice was dead, hollow. The night before our wedding, and she's entertaining some tradesman in her bedroom. What a fool I've been. What a blind, idiotic fool. We should confront her now, demand explanation. What explanation exists? Claudio turned to Don Pedro, and in the moonlight his face was aged, all youth stripped away. You championed this match. You assured me of her virtue. Were you deceived, or were you complicit? How dare you? How dare I? How dare she? How dare all of you? Claudio's voice rose, cracking with pain and fury. I was going to give her everything, my name, my future, my heart, and she's been playing me for a fool the entire time. Don Pedro felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. Even if what we saw was real, public shame is not the answer. Cancel the wedding quietly. Send her away, quietly. Claudio's laugh was bitter. So she can do this to some other unsuspecting fool, so she can preserve her reputation while destroying mine. No. Tomorrow, at the altar, in front of everyone, the truth will be known. Let her face the consequences of her actions publicly, as I would have celebrated our union publicly. Claudio, you're not thinking. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in weeks. Tomorrow there will still be a ceremony, Don Pedro, but instead of a wedding, it will be a revelation. He strode away into the darkness, leaving Don Pedro standing alone in the garden, sick with dread at what he'd witnessed and what would follow. What neither man knew, what they couldn't have known in the mist and distance, was that the woman at Hero's window had not been Hero at all. It had been Margaret the maid, wearing Hero's dressing gown, her hair arranged similarly, positioned by John to be seen from precisely the angle where Claudio watched. The man had been Borachio, another of John's confederates, a groundskeeper who'd been promised money to play his part. They'd performed their role perfectly, the innocent theater of lovers transformed by context and expectation into evidence of betrayal. In her room, Hero herself had slept peacefully through it all, exhausted from wedding preparations, dreaming of tomorrow's happiness, unaware that her reputation was being murdered while she slumbered. And in his own room, John poured himself whiskey with hands that were entirely steady, satisfied with an evening's work well done. By this time tomorrow, his brother's perfect match would be destroyed. Claudio's heart would be broken, and the self-satisfied household would be torn apart by scandal. The war had taught John many things, but primarily this, that destruction was easier than creation, that tearing down required less skill than building, and that misery shared was somehow more bearable than misery endured alone. If he couldn't be happy, why should anyone else be? The storm broke just before dawn, thunder rolling across the Cotswolds, rain lashing the windows of Messina Hall. Inside, the house stirred uneasily, servants preparing for a wedding that some were already whispering might not occur, though none knew quite why they sensed disaster approaching. Beatrice woke to the sound of rain and immediately went to Hero's room, finding her cousin already awake, dressed in her slip, staring at her wedding gown with an expression of nervous joy. "It's raining," Hero said. "They say that's good luck for weddings." "Then you'll have the luckiest marriage in England," Beatrice said, embracing her. "Are you ready?" "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The chapel at Messina Hall was small and ancient. Stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of christenings, weddings, funerals, all the ceremonies that marked human passage through time. Candles flickered despite the gray morning light filtering through stained glass windows. White roses from the garden adorned the altar, their scent heavy in the close air. The guests assembled in the wooden pews, neighbors, household staff, a handful of RAF officers who'd served with Claudio, everyone in their finest clothes, saved from before the war or carefully altered to suit the occasion. There was an atmosphere of gentle celebration, of communal relief that love could still triumph after years of darkness. Lady Leonora sat in the front pew, elegant in lavender silk, her face serene with satisfaction. Beside her sat Don Pedro, whose expression was considerably less peaceful. He looked like a man attending an execution rather than a wedding. Benedick stood with Claudio at the altar, serving as best man. He'd noticed his friend's strange demeanor, the rigid posture, the clenched jaw, the eyes that held something cold and furious. But Claudio had refused to explain, speaking barely a word all morning. The vicar, elderly Father Francis, who'd served this parish for 40 years, took his position before the altar, prayer book in hand. Then the organ began, Mrs. Quickly from the village playing Jesu, joy of man's desiring, and everyone rose. Hero appeared at the chapel entrance, breathtaking in her mother's ivory silk gown. Beatrice walked behind her as maid of honor, carrying a small bouquet. Hero's face shone with pure happiness, innocent and radiant, as she walked down the short aisle toward where Claudio waited. She didn't see the expression on his face. Her eyes were lowered, modest, as befitted a bride. Lady Leonora beamed. The guests smiled. Even the rain seemed to soften, as if nature itself paused to witness this moment. Hero reached the altar. Beatrice took her place to the side. Claudio turned to face his bride, and Hero finally looked up at him, her smile tremulous with joy. Father Francis began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. It is an honorable estate, not to be entered into lightly, but reverently and soberly." His voice was gentle, familiar, the words worn smooth by repetition, but no less sacred for that. If any person can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause. No one ever spoke. It was merely ceremony, ritual. "I have cause," Claudio said, his voice cutting through the chapel like a blade. Shock rippled through the assembled guests. Hero's smile faltered, confusion clouding her features. "Captain Claudio?" Father Francis looked bewildered. "I don't understand." "I'll speak plainly then," Claudio said, his voice rising, each word edged with fury. "This woman standing before us in white, this symbol of supposed purity and virtue, she's a fraud. A common whore dressed in bridal silk." The gasps were audible. Lady Leonora half rose from her seat. Hero went white as her dress. "Claudio, what are you—" Hero's voice was barely a whisper. "Don't play innocent," Claudio shouted. "Last night I saw you at your window with your lover, watched you embrace him, kiss him, welcome him into your bed the very night before you were to pledge yourself to me. Did you laugh about it? Did you mock the fool who believed you were pure?" "And no," Hero said, shaking her head desperately. "No, that's impossible. I was asleep. I was alone. Claudio, please, I saw you." His voice broke with anguish beneath the anger. "Don Pedro saw you as well. We both witnessed your betrayal." All eyes turned to Don Pedro, who stood slowly, his face wretched. We saw a woman at Hero's window, in her room, with a man. I cannot deny what we witnessed." Hero swayed and Beatrice rushed to support her. "This is madness," Beatrice said fiercely. "Hero would never, she couldn't." "The evidence of our own eyes says otherwise," Claudio spat. He turned to address the assembled guests. "I was prepared to give this woman everything. My name, my honor, my future. And she repays me with deception and infidelity. Let everyone here witness what becomes of false virtue and painted innocence." He turned back to Hero, who stood trembling violently, tears streaming down her face. "I do not marry you," Claudio said with cold finality. "I will not bind myself to corruption disguised as purity. You've made a fool of me, but at least I learned the truth before signing my name to legal bondage. Claudio, I swear before God." Hero reached for him, but he stepped back as if she carried plague. "Your oaths mean nothing. They're as false as everything else about you." Hero made a small, broken sound and collapsed. She fell like a puppet with cut strings, her ivory silk pooling around her on the stone floor. Lady Leonora cried out, rushing forward. Beatrice dropped to her knees beside her unconscious cousin. The chapel erupted in chaos, shocked voices, people rising, the organ silent, but somehow the silence more terrible than any sound. Claudio stood over Hero's fallen form, his face a mask of devastation, wearing fury as armor. Then he turned and strode down the aisle, out into the rain, Don Pedro following reluctantly behind. Benedick stood frozen at the altar, caught between loyalty to his friend and the evidence of his own reason. He looked at Hero, sweet, gentle Hero who'd never shown anything but kindness, unconscious on the chapel floor. He looked at Beatrice, cradling her cousin's head, her face transformed by righteous fury. And in that moment, Benedick understood that some choices defined a man's entire character. They carried Hero to her room, her body limp and lifeless as a rag doll. Lady Leonora followed behind, aged a decade in minutes, her hands trembling as she clutched her pearls. The guests dispersed in whispers and scandal, rushing home to telephones, eager to spread the tale of the wedding that wasn't, the bride exposed, the drama that would fuel village gossip for years. Father Francis remained, his elderly face troubled. He climbed the stairs to Hero's room where Beatrice sat on the bed, holding her cousin's pale hand, while Lady Leonora paced like a caged animal. "She's waking," Beatrice said as Hero's eyelids fluttered. Hero opened her eyes and immediately memory returned. She made a sound of pure anguish, turning her face to the pillow. "I wish I were dead," she whispered. "Let me die. Let this shame end." "There is no shame," Beatrice said fiercely, "because you've done nothing wrong." Claudio saw, Don Pedro confirmed. Lady Leonora's voice broke. "How can we defend against two witnesses?" Father Francis settled into a chair, his old hands folded thoughtfully. "May I speak? I've been a priest for 43 years, and I've learned to read faces, to distinguish genuine guilt from genuine innocence. When Hero collapsed, I watched her carefully. That was not the faint of someone caught in deception. It was the faint of someone destroyed by false accusation." "You believe her?" Lady Leonora asked desperately. "I know her," Father Francis said firmly. "I've known this child since her christening. She is incapable of the deception Claudio describes." He turned to Hero. "Tell me truly, child. Were you in your room last night, alone?" "Yes, Father. I fell asleep reading. I was alone the entire night. I swear it on my mother's memory, on everything holy." The priest nodded slowly. "Then someone has staged an elaborate deception. The question is who and why?" "John," Beatrice said suddenly, the pieces falling into place. "It has to be John. He's been bitter, angry, looking for ways to cause pain. He whispered the poison in Claudio's ear, arranged for him to watch. But how could he make them see Hero when Hero was sleeping?" Lady Leonora asked. "Someone else," Father Francis said. "Someone dressed to resemble Hero, positioned to be seen from a distance, in darkness and mist, with expectation coloring perception. A man sees what he expects to see." Beatrice stood, pacing now herself. "Margaret, the maid. She was nervous yesterday, acting strangely. She's Hero's size, has access to her clothes. Would Margaret participate in such cruelty? Perhaps without knowing the full purpose. John is clever, manipulative. He could have convinced her it was a prank, paid her, threatened her, any number of ways." Father Francis leaned forward. "Here is what I propose. We let the world believe Hero died from the shame of Claudio's accusations. We announce her death, hold a quiet funeral, allow time for truth to emerge. Meanwhile, Hero lives hidden here, safe and secluded. When innocence is proven, and I believe it will be, she can return to life vindicated." "Stage her death?" Lady Leonora looked shocked. "Buy time for investigation," the priest corrected. "If Hero appears in public now, the scandal adheres to her regardless of truth. Society has condemned her already. But if she dies, the narrative changes. Guilt, doubt, sympathy, these create space for questioning the accusation." Hero sat up slowly, her face ravaged by tears, but her voice gaining strength. "If this is the only way to discover truth, then I consent. But Father, I want justice, not just for myself, but for every woman whose reputation has been destroyed by lies. I want those responsible to face consequences." "They will," Father Francis promised. "Truth has a way of emerging, particularly when wicked men grow overconfident." Beatrice embraced her cousin fiercely. "We'll prove your innocence, Hero. I swear it." Downstairs, Benedick stood in the empty chapel, staring at the altar where such disaster had unfolded. He heard footsteps and turned to find Beatrice descending, her face set with determination and fury. "Benedick," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," he said immediately, moving toward her. "I need you to challenge Claudio. I need you to call him out, demand satisfaction for what he did to Hero." Benedick stopped short. "Beatrice, Claudio is my friend. And Hero is my cousin, my sister in all but blood. She is innocent, Benedick. Completely, utterly innocent. And your friend just destroyed her publicly, cruelly, without mercy or investigation. If you believe in justice, if you believe in honor, if you have any feeling for me at all, you'll stand with Hero against this wrong. You're asking me to potentially kill my closest friend. I'm asking you to defend an innocent woman against slander and cruelty." Beatrice moved closer, her eyes blazing. "This is the moment, Benedick. The moment when you choose what kind of man you are. Do you stand with power and privilege and masculine solidarity, or do you stand with truth and justice even when it costs you?" Benedick felt the weight of the choice crushing him. Claudio, his brother in arms, who'd flown beside him through hell, and Beatrice, who'd somehow become essential to his happiness in ways he was only beginning to understand. "If I do this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Claudio and I, that friendship ends." "Then let it end," Benedick said quietly. "I choose you, Beatrice. I choose truth. I'll challenge Claudio." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, the first time he'd seen her cry. She reached for his hand, gripping it with desperate gratitude. "Thank you. When this is over, when Hero is vindicated, I'll spend the rest of my life proving you chose correctly." "I already know I did," he said, pulling her close. They stood together in the empty chapel, holding each other while rain drummed against ancient stone, and somewhere above them an innocent woman grieved her murdered reputation. That afternoon, word spread through Messina Hall and beyond. Hero Messina had died of shame and grief. The announcement sent shock waves through the community. Some whispered she'd gotten what she deserved. Others felt the first stirrings of doubt. Did the punishment fit the crime? Did any crime exist at all? Claudio, hearing the news in the rooms he'd taken at the village inn, went white as paper. Don Pedro found him sitting motionless, staring at nothing. "She's dead," Claudio said, his voice hollow. "Hero is dead because of what I said." "She's dead because of what she did," Don Pedro replied. But his voice lacked conviction. He too felt doubt gnawing at his certainty. They'd seen something at that window, but had they seen what they thought? A knock at the door interrupted them. Benedick entered, his face grim and formal. "Claudio, I need to speak with you, alone." Don Pedro withdrew reluctantly. Benedick closed the door and turned to his friend with cold fury. "You killed her," Benedick said flatly. "An innocent woman is dead because you believed lies and acted with cruelty instead of compassion." "I saw her. You saw what someone wanted you to see. You were manipulated, used, and you were too proud and too quick to judge to question what your eyes showed you." Claudio stood, anger flaring. "You weren't there. You didn't witness." "I witnessed you destroy a gentle soul in front of everyone she knew. I witnessed you choose public humiliation over private investigation. Whatever you saw or thought you saw, your actions were dishonorable. How dare you?" "I challenge you," Benedick said formally. "Tomorrow at dawn, you'll answer for Hero's death with your life or your apology. Choose weapons, pistols, swords, I don't care, but you'll face me." Claudio stared at him in shock. "You'd kill me over this, over a woman you barely knew, over justice, over an innocent woman murdered by gossip and masculine pride. Yes, Claudio, I'd kill you for that." Benedick left without another word, leaving Claudio shaken to his core. Meanwhile, in the village, truth was emerging through the unlikely medium of drink and guilt. Baraccio, the groundskeeper who'd played the lover at Hero's window, sat in the public house, drowning his conscience in whiskey. He'd been paid well by John, but Hero's death weighed on him like stones. The village constable, an earnest young man named Dogberry, who took his duties perhaps too seriously, overheard Baraccio's drunken confession to the bartender. "Didn't think the girl would die from it," Baraccio slurred. "Just supposed to break up the wedding 'cause of scandal. John said it was a prank, a joke. But she's dead now. Dead because I wore workman's clothes and kissed a maid at a window. Dogberry arrested him immediately, thrilled to have an actual crime to solve rather than his usual fare of stolen chickens and public drunkenness. By evening the full truth emerged. Margaret, terrified and weeping, confessed to her unwitting role. John had told her it was a theatrical game, that Claudio wanted to test Hero's trust, that no harm would come of it. She'd worn Hero's dressing gown, stood at her window with Borachio, performed as directed, never understanding she was an actor in someone else's malicious play. The evidence assembled. Dogberry brought his prisoners to Messina Hall, where Lady Leonora, Father Francis and Beatrice heard the full confession. John had fled, disappeared during the chaos, taking a car and whatever money he'd had, heading God knew where. But his plot was exposed, documented, irrefutable. "We must tell Claudio immediately," Lady Leonora said, her voice shaking with relief and rage. "Hero must be restored." "Wait," Father Francis said thoughtfully. "Let Claudio suffer one more night. Let him face his challenge from Benedick, believing he killed an innocent woman. Let the weight of that sit on his soul. Tomorrow morning, soon enough for revelation. Tonight, let justice wear the face of guilt." It was harsh wisdom, but Beatrice saw the rightness in it. He should understand the cost of his assumptions. Hero nearly died from them. Let him believe she did. That night, Claudio couldn't sleep. He sat in his room, a pistol on the table before him, his choice of weapon for tomorrow's duel. He thought of Hero's face when he'd accused her, the incomprehension and anguish. He thought of her collapse, the way she'd fallen like something broken beyond repair. Had he been wrong? The question tormented him. Don Pedro insisted they'd seen what they'd seen, but doubt crept in like fog. What if there was an explanation? What if he'd destroyed an innocent woman out of pride and wounded ego? Dawn came gray and cold, the kind of English morning that feels like penance. Claudio stood in the meadow beyond Messina Hall's grounds, pistol in hand, waiting for Benedick to arrive and possibly end his life. Part of him welcomed it. If Hero was innocent, if he'd killed her with false accusations, then death seemed appropriate payment. Don Pedro stood as his second, troubled and silent. In the distance, Benedick approached with Father Francis beside him. But before they could close the distance, a commotion arose from the manor house. Figures emerged. Lady Leonora, Beatrice, the constable Dogberry with his prisoners in tow. "Stop!" Lady Leonora's voice carried across the meadow with commanding force. "There will be no duel. Not today. Not ever." Both men lowered their weapons, confusion evident on their faces. Lady Leonora reached them, breathing hard from her hurried walk, and her expression was a complicated mixture of relief and righteous anger. "Captain Claudio, you are a fool, a blind, presumptuous fool, but you are not a murderer, and we will not compound tragedy with more bloodshed. I don't understand." Hero was innocent," Father Francis said clearly. "Completely innocent. You were deceived by an elaborate plot orchestrated by John, executed by these two unfortunates who didn't fully understand the evil they served. Borachio and Margaret were brought forward. Between shame and fear they confessed everything again. The staged scene, the deliberate deception, John's manipulation. Every word drove deeper into Claudio's heart like nails. "No," he whispered, sinking to his knees in the wet grass. "No, please, no." "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice hard as iron. "You killed an innocent woman with your pride and your haste to believe the worst. Hero is dead because you chose public humiliation over private investigation, chose masculine outrage over trust and love." Claudio's face crumpled. He made sounds no language could transcribe, the raw animal noises of grief and guilt colliding. "I loved her. God help me, I loved her. And I destroyed her." "You did," Lady Leonora said coldly, "and now you'll live with that knowledge for the rest of your days." Don Pedro looked equally devastated. "I advised it. I confirmed what we'd seen. The guilt is mine as well." "Shared guilt doesn't halve the burden," Beatrice said. "It multiplies it." Claudio raised his tear-stained face. "Then let Benedick shoot me. Please, I deserve nothing less. I can't live with what I've done." "You'll live," Father Francis said, his voice gentler now, "because punishment is easier than redemption, and redemption is what Hero would have wanted. She was gentle, forgiving, everything you failed to believe she was." "What can I do?" Claudio asked desperately. "How can I possibly atone?" Lady Leonora exchanged a long look with Father Francis and Beatrice. A decision passed between them, something that had been discussed and debated through the long night. "You will mourn Hero publicly," Lady Leonora said. "You will compose an epitaph praising her virtue and acknowledging your wrong. You will hang it at her tomb and read it aloud before witnesses. You will spend 1 year in mourning, honoring the woman you destroyed." "I will. Anything. Everything." "And after that year," Father Francis continued, "if you've learned what love truly means, if you've grown beyond the jealous boy into a man worthy of devotion, there may yet be redemption available to you." "What redemption exists for killing the woman I love?" "Come with us," Lady Leonora said. "There's something you must see." They processed back to the manor house, Claudio moving like a condemned man toward the gallows. He was led to the private chapel where a catafalque had been erected, covered in white flowers, candles burning at head and foot, and beside it stood a woman in a dark veil, motionless and silent. "Approach," Father Francis commanded. Claudio moved forward on trembling legs. "Hero's body," he whispered. "Her spirit," Lady Leonora said. "The part you couldn't kill, because it was stronger than your cruelty." The veiled woman raised her hands and lifted the black fabric from her face. Hero stood before him, alive, pale but breathing, her eyes red from crying but open and aware. Claudio's knees gave out entirely. He collapsed again, this time before her, reaching toward her but not daring to touch, as if she were a ghost that might vanish. "Hero," he gasped, "you're alive. Thank God, you're alive." "No thanks to you," Hero said, and her voice was different now, stronger with steel beneath the softness. "I lived because those who loved me protected me. You would have buried me in shame. I'm sorry, I'm so desperately, completely sorry. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was every terrible thing. Please, if there's any chance, any possibility—" "Not today," Hero said firmly. "Today I'm simply grateful to be alive and vindicated. What comes after, forgiveness, perhaps eventually trust, those require time. You'll do as Lady Leonora said. You'll mourn the woman you tried to kill. You'll become someone worthy of her. And then perhaps we'll see." It was neither rejection nor acceptance, but something harder won and more honest, conditional possibility. Claudio wept with relief and continued guilt, kneeling before the woman he'd wronged, grateful she lived even knowing he might never deserve her forgiveness. Benedick and Beatrice had withdrawn to the garden, giving the scene privacy. They stood together beneath the oak where they'd first acknowledged their feelings, and the morning light finally broke through clouds, gilding everything with tentative gold. "You would have fought for her," Beatrice said softly. "For Hero, for justice." "For you," Benedick corrected. "I would have fought for you, because you asked, because it was right, because somewhere along the way you became more important than anything else.